Hello, my name is Frederick Atkinson, and for those of you who don't know me, I like books, essentially. It's my thing, and I've been talking about it on social media for some time now, and as per popular demand, I have finally made this my sort of YouTube podcast. I'll be uploading other versions of it onto other platforms, but this is my debut. I'm a little nervous. This is my first stab at it, at long-form stuff. I've got my notes in front of me, so bear with me, everyone, and please leave all your feedback, be it positive or critical, in the comments. Thank you so much. This podcast will be focusing on the history of English literature, focusing on the English language. That's why I'll also be covering, as we get to it, Irish literature, Welsh literature, Scottish literature, French literature, maybe some German literature, some American literature as well. So there's much to cover, but I'm going to start, well, like a story at the beginning of the English language. So we'll be doing Anglo-Saxon literature, Old English. Now there's not that much to cover in Old English, which is why I'll be reading chronicle work as well, sort of historical work, so that'll be interesting. So, as I will with every episode, I've decided I'm going to open with a prologue and then close with an epilogue. Something of my own creation, because I am a creative writer as well as a literary student. So, without further ado, let's begin. Thank you very much. It is the year 604 of our Lord God. My name is Osric, and I live in the land of the Eastern Saxons. I am 24 years old, but people often tell me I look younger on account of my small stature. It bemuses them to know that I, the son of Wulfric, of the Saxon clans, am a small man. My father was mighty. Born to farmers, he rose to warriorhood as if he were an Eoten, a giant of old. We buried him last winter. Even giants can be felled by pestilence. And so, here in this land of strangers and Eld enter ye work, the ancient work of giants, I too shall rest. I remember when my father brought me here. My mother, a slave woman from Gallic lands, screamed and kicked, but I was not hers to keep. I was plucked from Saxony and taken here, only 7 summers old. I hardly remember much at all. I do remember, however, the sea. Great serpentine drakes of foamy white water thrashed the ship. Spears of lightning pierced the peaks of towering waves, and a black sky crashed down upon us. The only thing of constancy were my father's eyes. I was holding a talisman to my breast. My father snatched the thing from my quivering little hands and cast it into the abyss. He replaced it with a crucifix. Even now I still have it at my breast, 17 years later in these lands. I suppose this is my home now that I have lain my father to rest here. His body stakes my claim to this fertile plain. It is the year 604 of our Lord. But it is also a Wednesday, Woden's Day. Thank you very much for bearing with me through the prologue. That was a bit of creative writing I whipped up on the train one day because I thought I'd open in the similar fashion to other podcasts with something narrative. That was to try and paint the scene of what it might have been like to be an Anglo-Saxon living during the Anglo-Saxon period in England. So just to give you a bit of time frame as to what we're going to be talking about. The Anglo-Saxon time frame is generally considered by historians to be between the 5th century, so the 400s, post-Roman Britain, to the Norman conquest of 1066. If you're from Britain or England, you will know 1066. The 14th of October is the Battle of Hastings. That's when everything changed, and we weren't just the Anglo-Saxons, the English, we were Europeanized. Some Normanno-French influence came into our aristocracy, yada yada. We'll get to that when we get to it. But this is the period, from the 400s to 1000, roughly. A nice 600-year period. nice round number, but it's also in what's called the Dark Ages. People have stepped away from the Dark Ages recently and call it the Middle Ages, or just the Anglo-Saxon Era. But I don't mind the Dark Ages. It's called the Dark Ages not because we lost all technology, the Romans fell, and Europe plunged into barbarism, though there's an argument that it did, at least from chroniclers of the time, which we'll get to. It's more that everything is dark. It is tenebrous. We don't know that much about it. The Romans were many things, and good chroniclers and good historians was one of them. Tacitus is an excellent historian, and because of him we know what was happening during the Roman conquest. I mean, his stepfather was one of the sort of generals in charge of, subjugating the Britannic locals. So, fair play to the Romans, and, the act of historical writing somewhat fell off after they pulled out and all chaos erupted. But regardless, I get ahead of myself. We're talking about the Anglo-Saxon period, remember, from the 5th century to the year 1066. Now, we're going to be focusing on the literature of this era. But I'll start with something rather simple. What is literature in this era? Well, in short, it's oral poetry, which is a bit sort of contradictory, because literature is something which is written down by definition, and that's how we know about these oral poems. Poems were spoken before they were ever put down onto a page with ink, so it's a very sort of paradoxical existence that they should be read. So I'll be reading out excerpts to you as we go on, because I want to honour the time-honoured tradition of reading poetry, which is why when you come to something like Beowulf, listen to the Julian Glover version on Audible. It's splendid. He's a Shakespearean actor. If you're more into pop culture, he's in Game of Thrones. He plays Maester Pycelle, the bumbling old maester living in King's Landing. That's him. Legendary actor. But regardless, I get ahead of myself. So we're going to talk about the oral poetry, the Latin ecclesiastical history. Ecclesiastical means relating to the church, so that'll be the likes of Bede when we get to that. And then there's vernacular chronicles as well. So literature, just to give you a definition of the word, it is written works, especially those considered of superior or lasting artistic merit. Which, is obviously a very subjective thing. What is worthy of merit? When we get to writers who are writing an ecclesiastical history, they obviously only deem people who converted to Christianity deserving of merit, but that's besides the point. What we're going to be focusing on in this period, there are two dragons at war in this period. There is the twin pillars, if you will. It's pagan heritage and Christian identity. That is what's going on in the hearts and minds of the Anglo-Saxon people. The sources will be made up of poetic fragments, historical chronicles, hagiography, which is the act of writing a biography for a saint, basically. It's writing for saints. And there's later reinterpretations I'll also be just sort of touching on later. Just a reading list of what we'll be going through. You can skip this because I'll be going through each one. This is just a couple of minutes. I'll be going through De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, written around 540 by Gildas. Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, written around 731 by the Venerable Bede. And then for some context and scholarship, we'll be looking at the Anglo-Saxons by Mark Morris, Old and Middle English and Anthology by Elaine Treharne. A Short History of English Literature is an old friend of mine, had this for a while, by Sir E4 Evans. And then the Pagan Religions of the Ancient British Isles by Ronald Hutton. Not sure where my copy's gone, but that's okay. And then we'll actually be focusing on some Old English poetry, of course. Because why wouldn't we, with some excellent poems which you can look up and find them online, because some of them are very short, and even the longer ones you can find them online, like Beowulf, the Seamus Heaney translation, for example. The Wanderer is one we'll be looking at. The Ruin, that's my favourite. Dream of the Rood is excellent. Judith is beautiful, and of course, Beowulf, my absolute favourite of all texts. We'll also be looking at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, because that's very, very essential, and there are later adaptations to consider. Grendel is a 1971 novel by John Gardner, which is from the perspective of the monster of Beowulf. It's excellent. Lord of the Rings, published roughly around 1954, by J.R.R. Tolkien, made all the more famous because of the Peter Jackson film series, that is heavily inspired by Beowulf and other Anglo-Saxon literature. J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor of philology at Oxford University. He was a scholar before he was a writer, and yeah, so he when you read Beowulf and other poems, you'll see lines which you'll think, that's straight out of Tolkien, and then you remember, no, Tolkien took it straight out of this. So this is the sort of foundations for that work and others. Just to give you a little bit of context as to what survives from the Anglo-Saxon period today, because especially if you're an American watching this, you might not have been taught so much about English history specifically, about certain periods of certain battles. Like why would you? You have your own history to be taught at school. So just to give a little bit of context, the Anglo-Saxons were originally pagan when they came over. I'll give more historical context later, and then they converted to Christianity, and that's why Britain is Christian. And just some surviving remnants of that is some of the days of the week are named after their pagan gods. The word Tuesday comes from Tiu's day, the day of Tiw. Tiw being the Anglo-Saxon version of Tyr, the god of war from Norse mythology. Wednesday is Woden's day, which is the day of Woden. Woden being the Anglo-Saxon version of Odin, the Allfather of the gods of the Norse pantheon. Thursday is Thunor's day, or Thor's day, and Friday is like Frigga's day, or Freya's day, kind of thing. It's so every time you talk about the days of the week, it's most likely you are describing that day to be beholden to a god who is no longer worshipped and hasn't been for over 1,000 years. So that's fascinating. The Anglo-Saxon standard English history as an archaic foundation to what would become English identity, which would be much more Europeanized in the future, which is why we have lots of French and Latin in our languages and not just the Germanic origins. And that leads me on to where they are from. The Anglo-Saxons come from Anglia, from Saxony, from Jutland, and from Frisia, which is in modern-day northern Germany, and Denmark and Scandinavia. So we came from the same area the Vikings came from, we English. So that just explains how we settled. There was a pre-existing population of Britons here, who the Romans were in charge of until the Roman Empire fell. And that's when we come into. So without further ado, we'll talk about the first text. This one is quite a brief text, but it's quite exciting. It's by Gildas. Now, Gildas was from Strathclyde, and he lived at the time of the Saxon incursion, when the Anglo-Saxons start coming in and, settling the place and pushing Wales back in the Welsh into what would be Wales and I'll talk about maybe what happened to the people who were existing already. Now, Gildas was born around 500. Some people argue it's before, and died around 570, I believe, in Brittany, in northern France. So he's one of the only true contemporary sources for this period, the beginning of the Anglo-Saxons. And it's worth mentioning, he may have cited the Gallic Chronicle as a source, so just put a little note under the word Gallic Chronicle and maybe have a look at it. But just to give you a little sort of snippet into what it may have felt like. You're a Britannic person like Gildas living here, and the Rome has fallen. You hear stories from your grandparents talking about what it was like when Rome was in charge. They may speak fondly and lovingly, or they may speak with scorn and poison in their mouth about what it was like when the Romans were in charge, because it was only a generation ago or a couple generations ago where the Romans left. So you hear your grandparents talking about it and what it might have been like, and then suddenly a new regime starts to take over, a new scourge takes over, and that's the Saxons and the Angles coming over. So I'll read a contemporary Gallo-Roman source, so a sort of French-Roman source, writing in the 450s. So that's a little bit before Gildas was born, and this is what Gildas would have experienced. The Saxon is the most ferocious of all foes. When you most expect his attack, he slips away. Resistance only moves him to contempt. Shipwrecks are no terror to him, but only so much training. He is no mere acquaintance with the perils of the sea. He knows them as he knows himself. Very formidable sounding foe, which would come on to be the English, and this is how they started. Very scary. And it's said that apparently the Saxons would even this may be just fear-mongering, but would abandon 1 in every 10 captives, toss them overboard into the sea or whatever, just as a sort of display of strength and barbarity and brutality. So very, very, very scary. But yes, this text by Gildas is De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, which translates to the ruin and conquest of Britain. The ruin being probably when the Romans fell, and the conquest when the Anglo-Saxons came in. But this is also a polemic Jeremiad against the sins of the rulers after Rome's withdrawal. So it's kind of like when, you know, there's that famous anecdote when Genghis Khan is said to have said, "You must have committed great sins for God to have sent me after you," which is just one badass line, but that's the same idea that Gildas probably has in his head. We have committed great sins, and now God has sent the Angles and the Saxons raiding us and attacking us, and Rome is no more. Polemic means a criticism, heavy criticism, and Jeremiad is a noun form, pretty much the same. So that's what he is. He's sort of scolding the sins of people. So the themes of this text about moral decay, divine punishment, and providential history, this is kind of how we know what it was like but also Gildas was only born around the time when the Anglo-Saxons came in, so he would have seen it firsthand, but he'd only would have started writing about it decades afterwards. But this is an exciting text. It's the foundation of what we're going to be studying, and it sets the tone for seeing history in a sort of moral setting, because it's morally relative, and writers of these times, historians, contemporaneous chroniclers or whatever you want to call them, they don't shy away from being biased. That's their thing. So this influenced the later Bede, whom I should love to come to. But first, I'm going to stop to talk about a little bit of historical intermission. So, before going on to the Venerable Bede, I need to emphasize that I'll be using the term Anglo-Saxons, but that refers to the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians, who came from Anglia, Saxony, Jutland, and Frisia. And I've explained where they are: northern Germany and Scandinavia. So they began coming over to what would become England and Britain in about the 400s, en masse. I describe them. I don't know if any other historians, I'm not a historian, but I don't know if any historians have described them as proto-Vikings. Proto being the Greek word for first. So the first iteration of Vikings. I don't know if any historians have used that phrase, but if you haven't heard it, you heard it here first, because they are proto-Vikings, because the Vikings came from the same area some 400 years earlier. To give context as to what that would have been like, European settling started happening roughly about 400 years ago from now into North America. This would be like the equivalent of British and French and German and other Western European people going in and raiding North Americans, Canadians and Americans. They would be like, what are you doing? We're like culturally and ethnically the same. Like we're allies. What are you doing? They might have thought that. Obviously, after 400 years, a lot changes and you become two different cultures. But that's exactly what it would have felt like when the Vikings came over around the 800s and 900s. At least what I imagine it to be. But regardless, the proto-Vikings is a phrase I like to use when talking about the Anglo-Saxons. Just to use a brief sort of simplifying term, what is called the heptarchy is what the sort of 7 kingdoms of England would have been like. Now, this is an oversimplification. It was constantly changing. Things were getting fractured. New kingdoms were popping up. It was a bit like the Wild West, but for sort of Germanic warriors, essentially. But to use the heptarchy as a simplification for our understanding of who settled where in the country of England, I'd say the Angles from Anglia settled in Northumbria, the north, in Mercia, a big bulk of Midland, and in East Anglia, unsurprisingly, in the east. Now, the Saxons from Saxony settled in West Saxia, or Wessex, in Sussex, and in Essex. And the Jutes from Jutland settled in Kent. That was one of the first kingdoms founded. And then the Frisians would have settled maybe in the Isle of Wight with the Jutes as well. Weren't as much of a sort of prominent settler, but it's worth mentioning that they settled. And Old English, the language that we know it to be, though I'll come to that on its existence, is apparently very, very similar to Frisian, modern Frisian today. So that shows that, that shows the connection to that land over there. So yes, so much of the historical sources that, like Gildas and Bede, which I'll come to, are tenuous, to say the least. They are based on word-of-mouth sources, which are biased, and the writers themselves are biased and will even admit to it. So to count everything written as truth is, well, it would be silly, but it's invaluable, to say the least, so we're not going to discount them. But also, things that don't really lie is archaeology. There's a wonderful book called Anglo-Saxons by Mark Morris, and Mark Morris made a very good point, saying the primary reason for people to bury their treasures, which metal detectorists or archaeologists may later find, aside from funeral proceedings, is fear. When the Romans started invading, people started burying stuff, and we can find stuff in the ground and date it to around that period. So people are burying it, as it was with Samuel Pepys, an English writer later, but I'll get to him in the series much later. So people buried their Roman coins and personal treasures in the hopes that they might later return to them at a marked increase, an astounding increase, during the implied time of this Saxon incursion, as Gildas says, thus validating Gildas's date given in the text. So Gildas says, a bunch of Saxons and Angles were coming over and ravaging us, ravaging the kingdoms and settling their own kingdoms at this time. And then the archaeological evidence says, well, a lot of things were being buried for safekeeping around that time, which is an act of a panicked and fearful person. So that's rather beautiful when you see those things lined up, but obviously quite scary and dark. It's important to say that the Britannic people still may well remain well within English identity. There's something called the elite transfer model, which is basically that saying that when one people take over a country from another, or make their own country, without ethnic cleansing, or without a great exodus, they must have integrated somehow, and the way to answer that is what's called the elite transfer model, which is essentially the Britons still remain there, but the Saxons and the Angles, their chieftains and overlords, remain as a sort of warrior-like aristocracy. That is the idea behind that. That's the elite transfer model. But of course, there's talk as well of exoduses, or exodi, perhaps, into Wales and Cornwall and up into Scotland. So we can only speculate as to that. But either way, it's the elimination of a culture and the replacement of another one. It's a tale as old as time. Doesn't make it any less sad, in my mind. And that's coming from an English person. Yes, and these are pagan people that slowly begin to turn to Christianity around the 600s, during what's called the Gregorian calendar, and sort of leads to something of a sort of proto-civil war, to use the term proto again, but we'll come to that. But the conversion of Christianity wins out, which is why a large amount of the Western Europe and Western countries are Christian. By 1066, historians estimate there to be, in England alone, 16 cathedrals, 60 monasteries, and thousands of local churches. That's a well-established religion, and it's only been kicking about for 400 years, contesting with a pre-existing religion. So fair play, Christianity. You dug your heels in. I'll be talking, there's figures. A great example of that actually is Mercia, that kingdom I mentioned in the Midlands. He was there was a guy called Penda, one of the last pagan kings of Mercia. Brutal man, won a lot of battles, fascinating stuff. So that's an example of paganism fighting back. And then you have another example of, up in Northumbria, I believe, maybe in Hexham, of St. Wilfrid, a bishop who lived there. He basically lived like a king, as supplied by Rome, because Rome wanted to Christianize England. So that's fascinating to see those two things at work there. To read about St. Wilfrid, read Stephen of Ripon's work. He's a hagiographer. Remember, hagiography is the writing of the lives of saints, and St. Wilfrid was indeed a saint. So that's what that is. To talk briefly about gender. Some people like to speculate that the Scandinavian Germanic peoples, that includes the English, were much more forward-thinking about gender, and there's evidence for that. I mean, there's much evidence of, you know, a woman may marry a king, and then the king dies in battle, and then their son, and she remains as the queen mother. That son may die. So there's long-standing traditions of women remaining in power and of great influence, surpassing all the men. However, it's likely not great. I mean, one of the things cited by Mark Morris, the historian, is that Tacitus, that Roman historian I mentioned earlier, he once cited Germanic women, women of the Germanic barbarian tribes, as independent and strong. But really, this was just to chastise Roman women's exercising of sexual freedoms and promiscuity. Basically, he was being a bit of a Puritan and saying, we should take an influence from these other countries, you know, their women know how to behave. That's what he was saying. So don't take that to heart, as some historians have. But yes, it's important to talk about gender roles because a lot of the people mentioned in this period of history are blokes. There's a couple poems named after women, a bit of that, but it's very patriarchal, as is a lot of history. But don't worry, when we get to the other episodes, we'll have much more of a gender balance there, which is always nice to see. Because most things are written about men, but you get strong influence on kingdoms via queen mothers and queens, regardless. So, anyway, that's the little bit of history out of the way. Let's move on to the second text, which is Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, or, to translate, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Bede was an Englishman himself, born in Northumbria, up in the northern kingdom. Don't know roughly when he was born, but he died in 735, so we're now in the 8th century here. Now, Bede is actually cited way more than Gildas. Don't know why, probably because he's working with more information, and actually saw the end, or roughly the end, of the Anglo-Saxon settling. Gildas sort of perished kind of halfway through it, but Gildas is still very important. Bede, he builds on Gildas, but in a more orderly, providential way, and he's basically focusing on the history of conversion, but accidentally records all the pagan stuff by talking about the people who are disgusting pagans, and we're like, oh, okay, so we can extrapolate, meaning build on information that is incomplete, on what he does not say, which is why Bede is so fascinating. I believe he's been given sainthood. He's the venerated Bede, the venerable Bede. He focuses on the missionaries, the kings, and the miracles occurring around this time. He has the famous Kedman's hymn in there, included in book 4 of his ecclesiastical history, and it's the earliest surviving Christian poem. So if that's something you want to look up Kedman's hymn. But I'm going to read you a little bit from page 103 of this. I printed it out here, and this is to give a little bit of context. Like, basically, in the 600s, that's when Christianity gets in. People arrive, the Anglo-Saxons arrive in the 400s, and then in the late 500s, early 600s, that's when late 500s, Pope Gregory goes, I want to convert them to Christianity, and the Gregorian conversion occurs. So that's what that is, and this is a little anecdote that Bede writes about his wonderful Pope, because Bede is a Christian, Gregory, before he was Pope, explaining why he wanted to convert the Anglo-Saxons into Christianity. I must here relate a story handed down to us by the tradition of our forebears, which explains Gregory's deep desire for the salvation of our nation. We are told that one day some merchants who had recently arrived in Rome displayed their many wares in the marketplace. Among the crowd who thronged to buy was Gregory, who saw among other merchandise some boys exposed for sale. These had fair complexions, fine-cut features, and beautiful hair. Looking at them with interest, he inquired from what country and what part of the world they came. They come from the island of Britain, he was told, where all the people have this appearance. He then asked whether the islanders were Christian, or whether they were ignorant heathens. They are pagans, he was informed, "Alas," said Gregory, with a heartfelt sigh, "how sad that such bright-faced folk are still in the grasp of the author of darkness, and that such graceful features conceal minds void of God's grace. What is the name of this race?" "They are called Angles," he was told. "That is appropriate," he said, "for they have angelic faces, and it is right that they should have joint heirs with the angels in heaven." "And what is the name of the province from which they have been brought?" "Deira," was the answer. "Good. They shall be rescued from deira, Latin for from wrath or wrath, and called to the mercy of Christ. And what is the name of their king?" "It is Aella," he was told. "Then," said Gregory, making play on the name, "it is right that their land should echo the praise of God our Creator in the world. Alleluia." That's the end of that excerpt. It's ludicrous, and I read it in a bit of a ludicrous fashion. Complete poppycock, just made up, probably. At least that's what a lot of historians say. It's something that Bede is clearly writing, which is quite clever. He's flattering the English by saying he wanted to convert us because we all look so fair and angelic. That's what it is. So it's actually brilliant propaganda. And it paints Gregory in a very good light. It's probably not true. These sort of anecdotes in history from this period, this was written in 731 AD, well, that's when it was complete, by the way, is just, done for reasons other than truth. There's rhetoric behind it, but regardless, it's a fun anecdote that lots of historians like to cite because it adds so much character into the one writing it, because we're wondering why he's writing that and how clever he is, Bede, into the one it's about, Gregory, and into the minds of the people who are being appealed to, the English, or the Angles. Yes, so that's that. But there's also another bit I'd like to quote to you. This is later on. That was page 103 of my text. This is the Penguin Classics version. In page 130, there's a little bit which gives you a vibe into what Bede is, the theology of what he's talking about. In here we have the politics of conversion, but in this little later section in sort of book 2, chapter 13 or whatever, we have King Edward's council, and this is what he thinks. This is another thing he's trying to appeal to the English. "When we compare the present life of a man on earth with that time of which we have no knowledge, it seems to me like the swift flight of a single sparrow through the banqueting hall where you are sitting at dinner on a winter's day with your thanes and counsellors. In the midst there is a comforting fire to warm the hall. Outside, the storms of winter rain or snow are raging. The sparrow flies swiftly in through one door of the hall and out through another. While he is inside, he is safe from the winter storms, but after a few moments of comfort, he vanishes from sight and into the wintry world from which he came. Even so, man appears on earth for a little while, but of what went before this life or what follows, we know nothing." This is to show the tension and the brevity of life and the need for salvation. This is Bede using the banqueting hall with a fire in the middle. That's very pagan, it's very Anglo-Saxon, it's quite Viking later on. People that would drink mead and eat meat and, sing and dance and tell stories in a very pagan fashion, not in the orderly Christian way of worship. And they've used that image, that structure, with something beautiful and delicate, like a swallow, which has been used before in Christianity, such as a dove representing the Holy Spirit, and he uses that to pierce through the pagan image and then flutters out, as if he's like showing them something nice. Look at this lovely thing, and then wafts it away, and then you sort of look at, oh, what was that? That's what he's doing with Christianity. People have already converted largely by the time of 731, but there will be pagan remnants, and there's always doubt, and religion is always trying to further entrench itself. That's why very religious people today are, despite being religious themselves and from religious communities, want to teach you about their faith. So that's what Bede is doing, and I think he's very, very clever. There's a reason why he's venerated by the church. He's done brilliantly here. Top marks. Bede, you Geordie monk, well done, as I say, from Northumbria, near modern-day Newcastle, where I studied, actually. Anyway, so that is Historia, Ecclesiastica, Gentis, Anglorum. The writing is, to describe the style, because I am an English literature person and not a historian, it's very difficult not to just talk about history for this very shrouded in darkness period, but it is fantastic. It reads like a narrative essay of theology and history, which makes itself seem like fiction because a lot of it is just fictional and fabricated. But at least he's written it down, because as much as we might decry Bede's biases to Christianity, the church and Christianization of England sort of rises hand in hand with historical enlightenment. When the Christians start to want to record themselves, that's how we know about things in history. Monks were the first true writers of this history. They were the first literate people that wrote down things. You know, Gildas was a monk, Bede was a monk. So, I mean, fair play. And I mean, that is with the exceptions of oral storytelling, which the pagans did for ages. There's a story in Bede's ecclesiastical history, I don't remember what page it is, but it's a story on the River Tyne, which is in Northumbria again, about some monks were putting supplies and building supplies and food or whatever on rafts on the River Tyne to float it down to help build a church or do whatever they were doing. But then the water took it away and they lost control, and they were trying to get control of these rafts and not lose their supplies. And some locals were watching them and jeering and laughing and way, which, quick aside note, we still do that, English people. If you're in a pub or something, and if someone drops a glass and it shatters, unless they're a bartender, because that's just rude, everyone without fail will go, "Way!" It's very childish and very silly and very yobbish, but we all do it. I don't know why. We've done it since school, and reading a story about people doing that over 1,000 years later, you know, the first forebears of the English people, slightly warmed my heart, you know, that we were a pathetic, petty people that like to jeer at other people's misfortune before going about our day. But regardless, these people were cheering, going, "Way!" you know, and then when they were later chastised for not helping the monks with their rafts, they said, "Well, you took our old way of life. It's very Game of Thrones, you know, the old gods and the new. You stopped us from our old fashions, and changed everything. You took it all." So that also shows the tension between the existing Christianity and the dormant paganism that was being snuffed out. So that's Bede. That's what he records. As I say, his style is very good. But we've got to talk about the actual poetry. Now, all these poems, you can find them online, pretty much. You can find them both in the... just look for a couple different... Scroll down a bit. And you can find them in their Old English, which you won't be able to understand, or their translations. Of which there are many. Just find them online. There's great ones. Elaine Treharne's Middle English, if you want a hard copy. This has pretty much everything I'm going to talk about and have spoken about, except like it won't have all of Beowulf or all of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or all of Bede, because like you can only fit so much. But it has both the Old English and the translation, which is like insane for one text. That's why it's a bit of a sort of gargantuan behemoth Brobdingnagian book. But this is excellent. Really worth it. It's worth a pretty penny as far as books are concerned, but also it's really, really worth it. In this text by the wonderful Elaine Treharne is recorded pretty much the entirety of the history I'm talking about. But of course, if you're doing a thorough research for a YouTube video like I am, you're going to want to buy Bede as well. The entirety of Beowulf, I have 3 different translations there, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the original Anglo-Saxon poetry in the Old English. But you know what I'm reading. But anyway, to quote the wonderful Elaine Treharne, the Anglo-Saxons wrote in a language that is both alien and familiar, and their texts reveal a world both strange and recognisably human, which I think is beautiful. That's exactly what made me fall in love with this period. Speaking of which, the poems I'm about to cite are dated roughly from the 7th to the 10th century. So from the 600s to the 900s, when, you know, the Anglo-Saxons had settled properly, and in everything, you know, the tumult of turning from pagan to Christian, flip-flopping back and forth. By the way, people do flip-flop back and forth. One of the first kings of England was he was who converted to Christianity. He converted to Christianity under the Gregorian conversion, and when he perished, all his lords and all his subjects turned back to paganism. And as Bede says, he wrote this in Latin, but translated into English, instead of saying they reconverted back to paganism, he writes, they returned to their vomit, or they returned to their filth. That is what he says verbatim, pretty much. Which shows how unbiased he is, and also shows how people flip-flop back and forth between these faiths, which is very fascinating. By the way, that was a king of Kent, as I say. Very interesting story about, I did a video on them. The Foundations says that two of the... This is more talking about... I think it's Geoffrey of Monmouth, another sort of 12th century writer. Essentially, there's a story of that King Vortigern, who appears in Arthurian legend. Again, I'll get that in the next episode because we're moving into early medieval period there. But King Vortigern was... he was a Britannic king around this time, it said, and he invited two kings, two Jutish kings from Jutland, to come help him deal with the Picts and the Scots and the barbarians attacking them, and they were Hensa and Horsa, which means stallion and horse. Two twin brothers with alliterative names, and they come over and they help, and then they decide, we're going to make our own kingdom, screw you. And that is the story of how the first English and the first English kingdoms came about. Complete fabrication again, probably, because it bears a striking resemblance, as I said in my TikTok video, to Romulus and Remus. Because, like, you know, it makes a great story. Twin brothers with names beginning with the same letter, both warriors, and one of them dies as well. Same goes in Hensa and Horsa. And the other one founds the kingdom. I mean, it bears striking resemblance. I think it was Mark Twain who said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So that's what's going on there. Same goes for legend, in my opinion. But regardless, I digress. We're talking about the poetry itself. To quote Sir E4 Evans, in his A Short History of English Literature, the Anglo-Saxon poetry is large. He's talking mostly about Beowulf here, but also about other poems. Is written in a long line. The lines do not rhyme, but each line has alliteration. That's talking about the form of the poetry. The poet has an extensive vocabulary. He uses sort of picture names for things and people he has to describe. So the sea is often called Swan's Road, and the body might be called the Bone House. Sounds very silly, doesn't it? Very childish and rudimentary. But that's what Old English really is. It's a rudimentary foundations, solely of Germanic origins, not quite. But it's very interesting. These, by the way, are words called kennings. A kenning is a word, in Old English specifically, made of two or more pushed together. Of my novel, which I don't have a copy with me now, actually. That's horrible marketing. I should have it in the background. But I wrote a novel called Shadowyenga, which is Old English for shadow goer, the name for the monster in Beowulf. Regardless, that is Elaine, Treharne, and Sir E4 Evans' thoughts. We're going to talk on The Wanderer. Anyway, The Wanderer is incredibly modern in the way this poem feels. It's beautiful. It's about transience, about sort of Christian consolation. But also it's very emotional in its modernity, and I just think that's amazing. It's basically The Wanderer. It's about a man wandering alone. The anhaga, which is the Old English word for a solitary one, or the erdstapper, which is a kenning, which means earth stepper. I'm sure you could have figured that one out. And the idea, basically, about the message from this poem, The Wanderer, is in Anglo-Saxon society, if you are a lone wanderer, the anhaga, that sucks. Basically, it's like you got the Dementor's kiss from Harry Potter or something. It's like you sort of being devoid of a lord and a community and a mead hall to drink and be merry with, and a cause, be you pagan or Christian, is just it's the worst thing. Like, you're wandering around. I'll read you a little bit and you'll see. basically. It's, yes, it's kind of like, actually, I've written here, like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, in the way that it is, like, that's a Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem, one of the Romantics. Can't wait to get to the Romantic era, but all in good time. Anyway, so yeah, it sort of shows a need for maybe a once pagan hall and feasting and a relationship with solitude. That's what I've written here. But I'll read you this little excerpt, and I don't know if I've said, but if you like Lord of the Rings, you'll recognise this bit, which I think is amazing, because I love Lord of the Rings, because I'm a nerd. Okay, this is from the poem The Wanderer. Where is the horse gone? Where is the rider? Where is the giver of gold? Where are the seats of the feast? Where are the joys of the hall? Oh, the bright cup! Oh, the brave warrior! Oh, the glory of princes! How the time passed away, slipped into nightfall, as if it had never been. There still stands in the path of dear warriors a wall wondrously high with serpentine stains. A storm of ashen spears took away the warriors' bloodthirsty weapons, wheered the mighty. Then storms batter these stone walls, frost falling binds up the earth, the howl of winter. When blackness comes, night's shadow looms, sends down from the north harsh hailstones in hatred of men. Okay, sorry to bring the mood down there, but that is an excerpt. So the beginning there, where's the horse, where's the rider? King Theoden says that in Lord of the Rings at their darkest hour. Is it during, when is that during? Is it Helm's Deep? Anyway, not the point. I mean, what a poem. Do you know what I mean? It's, like, the writing is very much, it feels like a pagan person or ancient Anglo-Saxon writing this, but the emotions conveyed in every single line, every single clause of every single line, is that of, boohoo, poor me, things are so bad. It's very Hamlet-esque. And that is always poetry I found easy to interpret, because it's pretty surface value, but also the feeling is deep, which means it's easy to relate to, I think. This would have been written down somewhere between, as I say, the 7th and 10th centuries, but the story, the words, would have been told orally by shops, which spells S-C-O-P, which is the Old English word for, like, a poet, a bard. The Scandinavian people had their equivalent, which was a skald. The English was a shop. So the shops would have been telling this verbatim throughout the centuries, and the fact that someone from maybe even the 5th or the 6th century, you know, from the 500s or 400s, was saying this poem, telling stories over a fire, and I can still read the translation or translate it myself and think, wow, that I can get that. That's cool. Not that I've ever been abandoned by my lord liege who have died in battle. That's why this poem's very good. As Anne L. Klink, a critic, says, the Old English elegies are poems of loss, displacement, and longing, but also of resilience in the face of a hostile world. And I fully agree with her there, especially at the line, sends down the north harsh hailstones in hatred of men. You'll find this as a theme, or a sort of motif in Old English poetry, about the poets, almost always anonymous, we don't know who wrote them, which is also amazingly beautiful, are writing about a world that hates them. The world spits out monsters that hate them, and that's an element of paganism, and this exists well into Christianized area, and this weird fusion, as I said at the beginning of the episode, of dragons battling, the Christian and the pagan dragons, or whatever, is just wonderful. Love it, love it, love it. So yeah, that's something I think is really, really beautiful. Check out The Wanderer. There are many different translations. Just have a look and see which one you like best. Some are very modern, some are very true to the original Old English, but I always find that's a bit of a shortcoming when it comes to translations, because if you're too true to the original, then you will lose the meaning and you translate too directly. Like sometimes there's no direct translations, as I found when I always ruin a translation because I try to take it too directly. But regardless, I digress. Let's go to another poem from this period. The Ruin. This one I really like. It is just beautiful. Let me find the copy I have in this book. Again, this book is amazing. It's a fragmentary poem, meaning we only have bits of it. The physical copy of the manuscript, again written down by a monk probably, but originally told orally. The physical copy of it is in ruins. Oh yeah, just absolutely love that. Doesn't that just tickle your kneecaps? Isn't that just great? Sorry. So let's have a look. The Ruin we'll find on page 94. Come on, where are you? Yeah. This is, it's badly damaged text, and it's a symbol of the impermanence of something. God, this is wonderful. This is an extract from the original Old English. It's Hreitlich is this welstan huirda gebrekon, which translates to wondrous is this wallstone broken by fate. So if I said this is a fragmentary poem on the decay of a once great Roman city, likely Bath. Bath is a town in the sort of towards the west of southern England, and it was a Roman installment named Bath because it was Roman baths, and the Anglo-Saxons chose not to build with stone. They could. Anglo-Saxon churches existed, but they chose not to. They preferred sort of gables of wood and thatch, and they prefer the warmth of it, of wood, I think, and fireplaces in it. Later, stone building would become most popularised maybe by William the Conqueror's castles, original wooden Motte and Bailey castles, but then later actual stone things, and that's what we know the medieval period. But before that, people are living in, like, if you want to picture it, picture the very popular Vikings. That's what these people are living in. And so when they see the ruins of the Romans who did build with stone, their villas and what have you, in towns like Bath, they would have looked with, like, wow, that's impressive, that's not our style, but that is beautiful, and thus poems like The Ruin come out. This one, it's hard to analyse it because it's so splintered. Yeah, I think it's a lovely poem. Look up The Ruin, you'll find this online as well. I think this is the poem in which one of my favourite phrases, which appeared in the writing I did at the beginning of the episode for you. It is Eld enter Jework, or Jewiork. And it translates pretty directly to the ancient work of giants, or the old craft of giants. The word enter is one of the Old English words for giants, and enters in Lord of the Rings as well, just to do that. But isn't it the word Eld enter Jework, the ancient work of giants? That is what they used to describe the ruins of the Romans. It was like some ancient race had come, and it was these old works crumbling. Hadrian's Wall, you can imagine a Northumbrian. Hadrian's Wall, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of about a waist-high wall that stretches miles and miles and miles and miles across the entire, it marks the original border between England and Scotland, and Hadrian built that just as a sort of marker, and to mark his territory, I guess, because it is not tall enough to keep out an invasion, but, Anyway, Hadrian's Wall, you can imagine an Anglo-Saxon seeing that, and it's not towering, it's not vast, but it is, it looks like it was, a massive amount of effort was put into it, which of course it was. And to an Anglo-Saxon that builds with wood, you'd think, what was that? This is some weird ley line laid by a giant, or what have you. So, The Wanderer is a beautiful thing, because in the Anglo-Saxon world we have the conversion of Christianity and paganism. But we also forget that Roman remnants still exist. So we've joined all three, this sort of triad of what the land of England is Roman ruins, Anglo-Saxon people, Britannic memory, and a new Christianization, I suppose. So The Ruin, really check that out. Now, again, from the same period, another poem. is called Dream of the Rood. This is really cool poem. Another way it's translated is Vision of the Cross. Rood is spelled R-O-O-D. Excuse me. Is an old English word for like rod. That's where we get the word rod from. But in this context, it means a cross. It shows how inelegant Germanic languages can be. You know, a crucifix versus a rod. But, you know, it's the nature of the thing. Anyway, so this is a visionary poem. It's about the vision of something. And it's basically about Jesus sacrificing himself on the cross. So very much a Christian poem. But it's written in heroic verse, in Old English verse. It's kind of from the perspective of the cross itself, like, which is fascinatingly pagan. And it describes it as a silicretriau, which is the, I pronounced that wrong, silicretriau, which is Old English word, phrase meaning, the loveliest of trees, or a holiest of trees. Describing the cross as a tree, I don't know, feels weirdly pagan to me. And to do that in a Christian poem feels blasphemous to me, surely, if you're someone like Bede. Like, we can really see it's completely Christian in what it's talking about, in its visions, but it's very pagan in its very pagan, bubbling under there. You know, these people have been pagan for hundreds of years and they've changed. So this Dream of the Rood is the intersection between this Christianity and paganism, which, as I said at the beginning, is the main theme of the Anglo-Saxon identity in writing, to my mind. And what everything that connotes to paganism, that of heroism and taking what's yours by the strength of the sword and the axe. And Christianity, acknowledging your inferiority to God and your subjugation to the papacy, to the church, both of which, you know, are fine examples, but to see them existing together in turmoil and tumult, in this sort of dichotomy in the hearts of these people, it's wonderful, and you can glimpse into the past with these poems. It is time travel, and I think it's beautiful. And the Dream of the Rood is a fine example of that. So blending the heroic culture with the Christian devotion is just amazing. Yes, I'll give this reading. This is the translated version, obviously. Then the young hero stripped himself, that was God Almighty, strong and steadfast. He climbed up on the high cross, brave before many. I mean, if you've read lots of Old English poetry, you know that's Old English style. Brave before many, tacked on at the end. It's like it's designed to be read aloud, because it is. You know, he climbed up high on the cross, brave before many, he, you know, gesturing and, you know, postulating to the crowd, to young children gathered around the fire. But this is written down by Monk. But also, the young hero stripped himself. That's not Christian. That is pagan. I'm sorry. Strong and steadfast at the end, and he climbed up on the high cross, brave before many. Like, what is being said is highly Christian, but the way it's being said, it's not, and I think that's so cool. And I just tacked on a Michael Alexander quotation. Michael Alexander has, in my mind, the best translation of Beowulf, but also lots of critical reviews. He said, "Old English poetry is the voice of a warrior society in which the bond between lord and man was the cornerstone of order." That's beautiful, and that's entirely true, and that shows that if the bond breaks, then you end up like the wanderer, you know, having a sucky existence. But I circled it here, actually. Yeah, no, I wrote it down. Like, the bond between lord and man. Michael Alexander didn't write lord with a capital L. But I was tempted to, because it seems that what was once a pagan society, like as displayed in The Wanderer, showed that aside from Woden and Tiw and Thunor and Frigg, aside from those actual gods, your god was your lord, your warrior king, and you followed him to the ends, and you battled all the other warrior kings and warlords, and that was the society. It was the strength of arms. And yet it seems that Lord was replaced with the Lord God, to my mind, which I think is fascinating. It's like, you know, in Ireland, I believe, during the conversion of Ireland into Christianity, there was, I forget, I should have researched this, but there was an Irish pagan goddess who was being very heavily worshipped, and the Christians, the missionaries, basically, and the church, took her and enshrined her into sainthood. They made her one of the 3 patron saints of Ireland, one being St. Patrick, of course. And so instead of saying, she doesn't exist, it's blasphemy, we'll kill you if you murder her, they said, no, she is enshrined, and God looks down on her fondly. We value her as a saint, but she is below God. Brilliant marketing. It's no wonder Christianity spread so well in Europe. Like I'm putting aside all theology and all personal philosophies, just objectively, pragmatically what happened and how to get people to convert, aside from truth or untruth, like the way it's told, that is brilliant. That is marketing genius. Like, that's excellent. And I think the same thing happens with the Old English, with the Anglo-Saxons, because they have their lord, but they've been replaced it. They haven't got rid of their lord. They haven't struck down their idols. They've replaced them. Replaced them or appropriated them, as long as God can be in charge. Excellent at compromise, these early missionary Christians. Excellent. Now, other shorter poems that you can read is The Seafarer, The Whale, Deor, Wolf and the Idwisser. The extra book Riddles are filled with excellent riddles. Some of them aren't that good at riddles, but some of them are very good. The Wife's Lament, The Husband's Message, and much more. If you want to buy Elaine Treharne's book, buy that, or just look up Old English poems. These are very easy to find. The good thing about poetry is that you can just find it on Poetry Foundation or wherever. Okay, now I'm coming to a little poem. If you've been following my social media, you'll know I very, very rarely mention this poem. It's pretty obscure to me. I don't really care much for it. It's called Beowulf. I'm kidding. If anyone is an old follower of mine, will be like, yeah, shut up, mate. This is my favourite text ever. Beowulf is the earliest, sort of biggest poem in the English language. It is the beginning of what would become one of the finest literary nations in history. One of, not the most. Don't worry, I'm not claiming the throne. We'll date this from the 8th to the 11th century, so maybe sometime in the 700s it was written down. This is when it was written down. Only one surviving copy exists, and it's in the, I think it's in the British Museum or the British Library. And it's actually fire damaged because of a great fire that happened a few hundred years ago, so, narrow dodge there. Now Beowulf is, I've been talking a lot about Christianity and paganism. This is, as well as being a stupendously powerful story, in my mind, with amazing writing, it is the culmination of that. It's, like, I'll talk about it in a bit, but it's heroic epic, blending pagan and Christian commentary. The story, as I say, is much older than the 6th century. It goes, like, it may be written in the 700s or whatever, but this goes way back. It actually takes place in what is modern-day Scandinavia, the areas where, or sort of northern Germany. This is where the Angles and Saxons and Jutes came from. It's written in Old English, so it was written by Anglo-Saxons. So, you know, there is something going on there about remembering where they came from, which is fascinating, which makes it both a Scandinavian story as well as an English story. But, of course, it's written by the English, in English, which is why we talk about it so much. The themes of heroism, fate, or weird, I'll mention that word before I continue, mortality, leadership. There's not much, as Mark Morris, the historian, was saying, there's not that much historical evidence for it happened, because there's monsters and dragons, but there is one character that we know probably existed in history called Hygelac, or Hygelac, so that's something, they put a nugget of truth in this fantasy story. But I mentioned fate or weird, and I think that came up, I mentioned it earlier. Weird, spelt W-Y-R-D, means fate or destiny. Now, the word weird, the modern English word, W-E-I-R-D, that means, well, we know what the word weird means. It's weird, it's odd, it's strange, it's different, it's hard to understand, whatever. Like, that's weird. Weird, W-Y-R-D, from Old English, evolved into meaning weird, the one we know it. I don't know why it changed over the years, but originally it meant fate or destiny, and it comes up a lot in poetry. Like, it's almost weird, it's treated almost like some sort of eldritch god, some abstract sort of protogenos of Anglo-Saxon mythology and poetry specifically. Like, weird, like it just says, it's like fortune can be weird. Like, you know, it's weird how much weird is used in this poetry. It's fascinating. And the fact that what we know to be meaning strange used to be destiny. I like to make a little pun with myself when people say something that's odd. I'm like, yeah. That's weird, mate. And in my head I'm going, that's destiny. It's a silly little joke. But that's a little note. And weird appears a lot in Beowulf, as well as the Wanderer as well. It's almost like weird, the god of fate, has cast poor fortune onto him. So that's fascinating. But Seamus Heaney, the amazing Irish poet, Nobel Prize winner, Nobel laureate, he has an amazing translation. His translation is less linguistically accurate, but very poetically accurate. He captures Beowulf's poetry and vibe excellently. I prefer Michael Alexander's, but Seamus Heaney's you can find online, actually. So I've never actually bought the copy. I probably should, just to support the idea of him, because I love Seamus Heaney. But yes, he said, Beowulf was a work of the greatest imaginative vitality, a poem that has a force field all of its own. I like you even more, Seamus, okay? Just chill out. Yes, there's frequent mention of a father and a lord, obviously implying that fella, but very rarely God. I mean, Beowulf at the end, spoiler alert, by the way, at the end, Beowulf as an old man dies, as we all shall. Ooh, I'm not sure why I did that. Anyway, talking of his god with his dying breath, he did seek fame and treasure throughout, though, and he really sought fame, like Achilles, kind of like, then no one will ever know your name, kind of thing. It's a story of pseudo-Christian warriors in a pagan world of monsters, is what I've written here. I just love it so much. Michael Alexander translation is what I'd recommend, but read whatever you want. I've just written down in my notes here, talk about Beowulf. I mean, yeah, I already have, but I will read an extract, and it's a bit of a longer extract. I can't help myself. It's the moment where Grendel, the monster Grendel, after whom I named my book Shaluyenga, I think is one of the finest monsters. He has a mother, Grendel's mother. It's great. He's this sort of fearsome, hateful monster described as kindred to Cain. So there's another biblical aspect. That's Christianity there. But only used as a metaphor. It's kind of like what the Romantics did later on. They used classical imagery as a poetic tool that was separate from their faith. And here we see Christianity talk of Cain and the Lord and the Father, used as a poetic tool to display paganism. It's very, very interesting. There's talks of dragons and monsters in this. I don't think it's in this extract. So at the end, it's sort of there's three monsters that are overcome throughout this story. Grendel's mother, the dragon, the last of which kills Beowulf. But that's only after Beowulf gets to be a successful king of his kingdom for 50 years. So that's cool. But the dragon sits on his sort of gold, and then a burglar, this is in Beowulf, a burglar comes in, a sort of wretched man, steals a cup, and the dragon, when it wakes, it notices the cup missing and goes nuts, and then burns everything down, burns the hall down, and then Beowulf, bringing 12 men, a party of 13 in total, go and they kill the dragon. Well, actually, the men flee, and Beowulf has to kill it with the help of one man who remains with him. I mean, Tolkien, are you not seeing that? I mean, that is Smaug, and that's like the 13 dwarves that go off in The Hobbit as well. That's like Tolkien like takes so much from Old English, and it's not. I don't at all see it as cheap. I mean, he's taking inspiration from his cultural history and adding to it. I think Tolkien adds to all this, and this in turn adds. It's wonderful symbiosis of storytelling going on there, especially considering that J.R.R. Tolkien was such a fine scholar and did it due justice. So that's really, really cool. Grendel's my favourite villain, though, and Grendel's mother is like... She's not at all in the wrong, and she dies anyway, so that's a bit tragic. But yeah, so I'm going to, actually, if you'll permit me, read, I don't know, like, probably like 100 lines worth of poetry, and each line looks about that. You know, oh no, that's not that. Each line looks about those lines. Sorry, this poor book is desperate to be retired. Anyway, I'll read the first line in Old English, as does Julian Glover, the actor who does the audiobook on Audible, because it's fun and it sounds good. So skip this if you don't want to hear any Beowulf, but this is my attempt at reading it. I'm no actor, but I like stories, so wish me luck. Ta kom of mor under misletum, Grendel gongan, goddess I bear. In off the moors, down through the mist bands, by the way, I'm using the Seamus Heaney translation, God-cursed Grendel came greedily loping. The bane of the race of men roamed forth, hunting for a prey in the high hall. Under the cloud murk he moved towards it until it shone above him, a sheer keep of fortified gold. Nor was that the first time he had scouted the grounds of Hrothgar's dwelling, although never in his life, before or since, did he find harder fortune or hall defenders. Spurned and joyless, he journeyed on ahead and arrived at dawn. The iron-braced door turned on its hinge when his hands touched it. Then his rage boiled over, he ripped open the mouth of the building, maddening for blood. Pacing the length of the patterned floor, he stepped inside now, with the loathsome tread, while the baleful light, flame more than light, flared from his eyes. He saw many men in the mansion sleeping, a ranked company of kinsmen, and warriors quartered together, and his glee was demonic. Picturing the mayhem, before morning he would rip life from limb and devour them, feed on their flesh. But his fate that night was due to change. His days of ravening had come to an end. Mighty and canny, a great warrior of Hygelac's kinsmen was keenly watching, poised for the first move the monster would make. Nor did the creature keep him waiting, but struck suddenly and started in. He grabbed and mauled a man on his bench, bit into his bone lappings, bolted down his blood, and gorged on him in lumps, leaving the body utterly lifeless, eaten up, hand and foot. Venturing closer, his talon was raised to attack Beowulf, where he lay on his bed. He was bearing in with open claw when the alert hero's comeback and armlock forestalled him utterly. The captain of evil discovered himself Beowulf's fight within a hand grip harder than anything he had ever encountered in any man on the face of the world. Beowulf's got him by the arm. Every bone in his body quailed and recoiled, but he could not escape. He was desperate to flee to his den and hide with the devil's litter, for in all his days he had never been clamped or cornered like this. Then Hygelac's trusty retainer recalled his bedtime speech made the previous night, sprang to his feet, and got a firm hold. Fingers were bursting, the monster backtracking, the man overpowering. The dread of the land was desperate to escape, to take a roundabout road and to flee to his lair in the fens. The latching power in his fingers weakened. It was the worst trip that Terrormonger had made to Heorot. And now the timbers trembled and sang, a hall session that harrowed every Dane inside the stockade. Stumbling in fury, the two contenders crashed through the building. The hall clattered and hammered, but somehow survived the onslaught and kept standing. It was handsomely structured, a sturdy frame braced with the best of blacksmith's work inside and out. The story goes that as the pair struggled, mead benches were smashed and sprung off the floor, gold fittings and all. But then no shielding elder would believe there was any power or person upon earth capable of wrecking their horn-gabled hall, unless the burning embrace of a fire engulf it in flame. Then an extraordinary wail arose. A bewildering fear came over the Danes. Everyone felt it who heard that cry as it echoed off the wall. A god-cursed scream and strain of catastrophe. The howl of the loser, the lament of the hell serf keening his wound. He was overwhelmed, manacled tight by the man who of all men was foremost and strongest in the days of this life. So that is the moment Grendel realizes he's losing after tormenting Heorot and Hrothgar for many years, I think 7 years or so. Thank you if you listened to the whole thing. Welcome back if you skipped over it. That's Beowulf, and I hope a bit of the magic of that poem has, well, I hope the bug's bitten you now, and that you go give it a read, because, I mean, I'm biased because I'm English, and I like the connection I feel with these old stories, but like also I think objectively that is powerful stuff, because I still feel, I still adore the likes of works from Dante Alighieri, from Homer, from Dostoevsky, and people from other countries. So that is Beowulf, and I hope I've bitten you with the bug. And you know, as much as people love Greco-Roman stories, people love Greek mythology. I mean, it's what got me half my followers on TikTok. I should do some more coverage of that. Like, I do wish people would give Germanic and Slavic mythology the same love, especially writers as well, like I've tried to do, but experimentally, because it's dark and it's putrid and it's confused and furious, and I think that's beautiful as far as storytelling goes. But of course, fair play to the Greeks and the Romans. Like, that's just some of the best mythology ever. But anyway, that is Beowulf. That was my reading. The other poems, check them out as well. Let me know in the comments if you've read them and what you think of these. I'm going to move on from the Old English stuff and talk about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So, as Bede built off of Gildas, a man called Alfred the Great, born in 848 and died in 899. He is one of my heroes. Now, I'm delving into history here and moving away from literature, but I'm going to mention him anyway because I think he is so cool. He basically came... so we're in the late 9th century right now. So the Anglo-Saxons have settled, and it's actually Alfred the Great's fault why people use the term Anglo-Saxons, even though that wasn't, because he tried to unite the fractured kingdoms of England into one, because there was a little problem called the Vikings, although people didn't call them Vikings at the time. They were called pagans or Northmen, or Norse, or if you're in Scotland, I think the Lamaks or something like that, but don't quote me on that. The Vikings is actually a term that the Vikings used, as in Vikingur, to go out Vikingur. It was a verb rather than a noun, but somehow it's become the name. Anyway, Alfred the Great is dealing with that, and yeah, the Vikings do a bit of a number and do exactly to the English what the English did to the Britons, in a piece of historical and poetic irony. But ultimately, Alfred the Great wins. He defeats them, having been defeated himself a fair bit. It's very much an evenly matched contest. But the Vikings is a hard foe to beat because they're everywhere and they take to the sea, and their guerrilla warfare is excellent, and they're well entrenched. It's very interesting. It's like they're like cousins or siblings, the Danes and the English. It's fascinating. So that's a bit of history, which is good. But anyway, Alfred the Great commissions the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and like I say, it's his fault that we have the Anglo-Saxon word, because he described himself as king of the Anglo-Saxons, despite only being born as king, being coronated or crowned as king of the of Wessex, the West Saxons. There's all the rest, much of Northumbria and the North and East Anglia. The Vikings have got that. They've been settling and raiding and attacking and moving in. So that's what's happening there. Eerily similar. Like Mark Twain said, history rarely repeats itself, but it often rhymes. That's exactly what's happening here, which, fair enough. So the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was commissioned, as I say, by Alfred the Great. I think he's such a cool guy because we're in the 800s here, and he believed 1,000 years, pretty much almost exactly 1,000 years, before mass literacy was a thing in Britain, that people should be able to read and know of their history. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is the first continuous national history of any Western people, written in its own language, not just Latin. I should also mention that Chaucer is probably to thank. I'll talk about him in the next episode. Chaucer is also to thank for English being, considerable to write in, but Alfred the Great laid the foundations for it as well, which is amazing. It's in Old English largely because he thought that they shouldn't just be Latin. He was a very religious man, but clearly was not a slave to the papacy, which I think was interesting, which probably connotes the later Protestantism which comes in around the time of Henry VIII. But regardless, Alfred the Great, this book builds on Bede, just as Bede builds on Gildas, and it's very interesting. I've read it, I've skipped through it, read many passages. Some of it is fascinating, but I mean, it's a chronicle. It's sort of a contemporaneous history keeping, not narrative. Some aspects of it are narrative. It's compiled over several centuries, even after the Anglo-Saxon period kind of ends. And it is just excellent. Its sources are built on the on what's called the core, which we don't really know what it is. We don't know what their sources are, but it doesn't really matter because we have this. Yeah, so I think that's what's happening. Alfred, as I say, believed that people should be literate, should know their own history. Latin should not be the de facto language for writing. Of course, and as I say here, the only thing wrong with his belief was that he was premature. It was too early, The printing press wasn't invented until, I think it was 1440. It was by a chap called Johannes Gutenberg, a German. So, I mean, it would be very hard. But still, Alfred the Great laid the foundations after, beating the Vikings, and he was a chap that, any town that has, burr in it, like Edinburgh, comes from the Old English word burg, because that's means a fortified town. He fortified all the towns, so that's another bit of sort of linguistics that he's contributed to. But although not that many people know about him, interestingly. I mean, in England everyone's heard about him, but people don't actually know about him. Regardless. In entry 896, there's talk of King Alfred's orders of warships to be built swifter, steadier, with more freeboard than others. So he's trying to meet the Vikings on their own level by the water. Alfred the Great was an interesting thing. He'd been to Rome himself. He had I think he'd been to Jerusalem, and he'd known the Patriarch of Jerusalem. And he even had apparently an embassy, or not an embassy, an ambassador, some sort of communication with people living in what's modern-day India, in the Sindhu Valley, that's fascinating, much more widespread than you think. So, and also in entry 1003, Alfred was the only reason England isn't speaking Danish, probably, which is why he's called the Great. When the general weakens, the whole army is greatly hindered. So he was a fella that held fast and also led his contributions to what he believed literature should be, is why I'm including him in this, and of course the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is fantastic. Despite being a king in wartime, he was also a scholar, or a person who believed in scholarship. And he was doing all this while having Crohn's disease, by the way. It's believed that he had Crohn's disease. It messes up the lining of your stomach, and you defecate a little bit much. So he's going into battle with that, and sitting down and writing a lot with that. Fascinating. He learnt Latin by, in his 40s or something. Stuff like that. Really cool guy. I like him a lot. And his contributions to literature is what validates him for this podcast. As I say, it's not an exciting read, and it builds off of Bede, who probably is a bit more exciting, I think. There's more narrative vibe here. Each entry here is just they'd write the year, and they'd say, in here, this happened. in here, this happened. Bede has a bit more flow to it because he's trying to coax people into Christianity more, or to deeper entrench it. The source material is known as the core, as I've said, transplanted into the text that we know. This is invaluable and has aided us into ushering in the medieval age from the Middle Ages, or as I say, the Dark Ages. Now, that largely concludes. I know I probably should have ended on something like Beowulf, but the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles is, I mean, it's chronologically what came later. And chronology is the vibe of this podcast series, I think. The later reimaginings. That is something, I won't talk about it too much because we're all very familiar with them. But Grendel, 1971, not that well known. That is rewriting Beowulf from the perspective of Grendel. It starts before Beowulf, the story, and goes on, and it's written in a modern voice. Even a bit Americanized. He says "Mama, Mama" when he's calling for Grendel's mother, horrible sort of marsh hag monster, which is fascinating, I think, and it's very beautiful. It's existential. It's nihilistic. What is meaning versus chaos? It adds so much to Beowulf. And it takes place before, so I guess you can read Beowulf before, and then read Grendel. Because Grendel will be a much easier read. You can read it in a day. It's a very short novel. I think it's a novella. And also, it's like, well, a couple of days to read it maybe. But it's so good because it's like when you read a story and you think of the villain gets slain, you're like, yay. And then you get the backstory and suddenly you feel bad for the villain. That's exactly what Grendel, the 1971 novel, does. John Gardner's amazing. He's written books on how to write books, on the craft, on psychic distance and other techniques, which many writers, even today, are completely ignorant of, which makes their work suffer for it. So John Gardner is really, really impressive. Always gets my vote. Grendel is a tragic anti-hero, and not just the other, kindred to Cain, but he is evil, but it's so good, and you feel his pain. And, the ending just, like, I knew the ending was coming because I've read Beowulf, and you've now read a little bit, thanks to me speaking at you, if you didn't skip that bit. It's just, Grendel, really good. But you guys are more interested in something like Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien from the mid-20th century. Now, we all know the story Lord of the Rings. I've got 3 copies there. I think I've got The Fellowship of the Ring, The Silmarillion, and The Return of the King. I have no idea where my Two Towers is. I have another paperback, but anyway. Lord of the Rings is amazing. Tolkien, as I've said, was a philologist, but also a lover of Anglo-Saxon literature and drew heavily on Beowulf. There are themes, obviously. I mean, we know the story of fate, loss, elegy. The Wanderer echoes "Where is the horse and the rider?" Aragorn's lament of Rohan directly echoes many passages. It's just beautiful. But also, I also love Tolkien's work, that he wasn't just about what is old in English culture. He talks about what's new and what he loves. Tolkien was a man who went to war. He was in the First World War. And apparently some people said on notes he wrote some of the beginning of The Hobbit. Probably not true. It was actually a student of his whose work he was marking. That probably inspired him. But Tolkien, he wrote... You know, The Hobbit, Frodo and Bilbo, when they're back home, they just want to draw maps and write books, drink tea, garden, have a beer, have an ale. That's a countryside English person. That's what Tolkien, even though he wasn't probably a country boy, wanted to do. And as someone who's a bit of a country boy myself, that's, very English. That's, a current English rural vibe with the origins of the English rural vibe, the Germanic paganism and all that, and Tolkien puts all of that in there. And obviously war. The man went to war himself. It's fascinating. And when you know all this stuff, the backstory of Beowulf, the backstory of Tolkien in the First World War, the desire to just be at home with your garden, with smoking your pipe, and how much of the man really puts his own forlorn nature in there. The stories won't just be some epic, exciting story. They'll be really poignant about what English culture meant to Tolkien and the man himself, what mythology means to us, and what language means to us. As I say, there's that phrase that he didn't create languages because he's been inventing languages since he was 14, according to an interview he did. He didn't just invent some languages like Quenya and Sindarin, 2 types of Elvish, for Middle-earth, for Lord of the Rings. He created Lord of the Rings for the languages, to give a vessel for his love of philology. And that he has a translation of Beowulf, Tolkien does as well. It's a very good translation. So, fair play. My closing reflections is, I suppose, the time and transience of culture as expressed through poetry, how we can glimpse into the past with poems, and how important it is to preserve knowledge. I have the oldest scripts and notebooks from stuff, and I don't even like what I've written in them from school and from my first years at university. I'm never throwing them away. I'm going to store them forever, keep it all. That's why we have, and if we all do that, and that's the way we treat archaeology and literature, then we'll have these, the equivalent of these, 4,000 years in the future. Of course, everything might be digital then, but still, books, may they always remain sacred. That is what to take away from this. Sorry to get a bit deep there. Of course, pagan and Christian present. I've been yapping about that a lot. The warrior ethos, Christian reinterpretations. I've explained it in depth now. I'll end first with a quotation from the critic Nicholas Howe, and then I shall finish an epilogue, which will echo the prologue I read at the beginning. So, Nicholas Howe. The Anglo-Saxons wrote England into being. Through their chronicles and poems, they mapped the land as both a physical place and a cultural identity. I couldn't agree more, Nicholas. And I'll end now with this very brief saying, Epilogue. It is the year 605 of our Lord God. A man came to my home and asked that Bishop Mellitus, who had come to preach to us, could commission a church, perhaps? He offered much fine compensation on behalf of his clerical master. I wanted to say yes, but my wife's father is not a Christian man. I do not want the anger of him. But my father was a Christian, and this was his land before me. Come back on a different day, I told him. I touched the crucifix at my breast, and look about my steadying my hide. Perhaps tomorrow I shall go hunt a hart. I could give the mount to my wife's father as a gift. It would please his pagan soul, that would. Perhaps tomorrow I could go to London and see Sebert's new cathedral dedicated to St. Paul. Perhaps tomorrow I could fell that tree which my wife says blocks her view. It is a large tree, and would take time. But tomorrow is a Wednesday again. In the eyes of the Lord God, I will always adhere to the Sabbath. But in my heart there is an upset on Wednesday. Woden's Day.